Could we talk about the role of religion in the Roman Empire? What's the story there?
I mean, religion's interesting because, in my mind, the rise to dominance in a lot of the world of monotheistic religions is one of the huge sort of turning points, because it's just such a different mentality. I mean, it's very, very different where you say there's one God and it's my God versus, okay, I believe in this God, but there's an infinite number of legitimate gods. And nowadays, particularly in the West, we tend to view the monotheistic perspective as the norm. But for, more than half of human history, it was not. It used to be the notion in a lot of Roman history up until about 300 AD. The idea was, well, there's just a ton of gods floating around, and maybe you worship that one, and I worship these two that I like, and the guy across the street worships the oak tree in his backyard, and it's all good. They're all legitimate things versus, oh, no. Now there is one God and only one God that's the correct answer. And as soon as you do that, religion becomes foregrounded in your decision-making much more. I mean, the Romans had religion, but it wasn't really driving anything, if you know what I mean. It was auxiliary to things rather than a central force. So for a lot of Roman history, you had a standard kind of, pagan polytheism where there's a bunch of gods. There's certain gods who are associated with the Roman state. And there would be prayers said to those gods on behalf of the Roman state. But it wasn't really, you weren't trying to execute the will of Zeus or something, or of Jupiter or Mars or anybody else. And in your private life, it was the same thing. You might ask certain gods for help, but it wasn't as much of a dominant thing in your own existence. So I think that's a real transition point where religion started to become so foregrounded. And as soon as you get the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in particular, it really shifts how people start to think about themselves in relationship to the world around them.
So Jesus was born during the rule of Emperor Augustus.
Yep. Which is kind of neat that, really influential people in the realm of political events and religious events coexisted. What are the odds?
I mean, yeah, there's certain moments in history where just a lot of interesting, powerful people come together and make history. And he was crucified under Emperor Tiberius' rule.
Yep.
Why were the ideas of Jesus seen as a threat by the emperor?
The thing that causes conflicts between the Romans and Christians is a little bit strange. It's all with this, where the Romans had a tradition of, on the emperor's birthday, sort of saying a prayer, basically wishing him good luck. Mm-hmm. Okay, but technically it's in the form of sacrificing to that part of the emperor that might become divine after his death. So to the Romans, this is the equivalent of a patriotism act, saying, the Pledge of Allegiance or something to the country. But of course, to Christians, this is worshiping another god. Mm-hmm. And I think there's almost a failure of communication here, that the Romans just, at least initially, didn't quite understand this is really problematic for these people because they're coming from a polytheistic perspective where, yeah, everybody has different gods. So what? This isn't a religious problem. This is a political one. That why won't you send good wishes to the emperor? If you're a loyal Roman, this is something you should want to do. And many of the early Christians, I think, would have been fine with that, but it took the form of what they were asked to do was to basically worship another god. And that was the sticking point. And this is where I think movies have kind of warped some of our images of Roman history, that Hollywood loves to depict very early Christians, and I'm talking like first 200 years here after the ministry of Christ, as a group that all the Romans were obsessed with, that they were constantly trying to persecute and all this. And honestly, I think the Romans at that point were more just sort of indifferent or didn't know what was going on. And if you look at some of the primary sources of that time, I mean, there's this very famous letter by a guy named Pliny, who was a Roman governor of a province in the east, and he has the habit of writing letters to the Roman emperor at the time, who was Trajan, every time he had a problem with being governor. And so this is great. This is the two highest governmental officials in the Roman world sort of hammering out policy between them, right? The emperor and one of his governors. And so this is about 100 years, 100 AD about. And Pliny says, hey, emperor, I had this issue. I had these people come before me called Christians. I don't quite know what to do with them. What should my policy be? And here's what I know about them. And what he knows is almost nothing. I mean, it's this almost comic, like garbling. And, they have this weird thing where they get together on some day of the week and they sort of swear oaths to one another not to do bad stuff, which is, of course, his garbled understanding of the 10 Commandments, And then they have breakfast together and they eat food, and this is communion, but he doesn't get that that's what's going on. And so he's really ignorant. But I think that the broader point is, okay, this is one of the best educated, best traveled Romans who has the most experience in the empire, has been all over the empire. And what does he know about Christianity? Basically nothing. So if one of the best educated, most widely traveled guys really doesn't know much about them, that kind of suggests that not many people did at this point in time.
At this time, it was a fringe movement that really did.
Very fringe. I mean, it was one of, hundreds of little mystery religions the Romans sort of thought of them as. And these are, religions that have some sort of revealed knowledge and that make more personal appeals to people. Now, stepping back from this in a broad way, I think you can say that Christianity really was different in some ways and had some things that maybe the Romans should rightfully have viewed as a threat. I mean, the Romans are people very focused on this world, right? Citizenship, what you do. Christianity, in essence, has a focus on the next world. So this world isn't as important as what you're setting yourself up for. And even worse, from a Roman perspective, I'm kind of saying, okay, if I were a Roman, Romans are all about making distinctions between people. Citizen, non-citizen, man, woman, free, slave. Christianity comes along and says, in God's eyes, you're all equal. Now, that's a pretty problematic idea if you're deeply invested in Roman hierarchy. And I think it is no surprise that among the earliest converts to Christianity are women and slaves, and in particular, female slaves. Now, who are they? They're the people at the rock bottom of the Roman hierarchy of status, right? Which the Romans are obsessed with status. But here's a religion that says that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And in that same letter to Pliny, Pliny says, okay, in this group of Christians I've heard about, their leaders are 2 female slaves they call deaconesses. Now, this is really early. This is before the church exists, right? There's no church structure yet. And who is leading the local congregation of Christians? 2 slave women. So that's an interesting moment, and that's not necessarily the image we get of early Christianity. But you can see how for people in this social structure, that would be very appealing to them. And in some ways, yeah, it is sort of a threat to the Roman system because they're challenging it. Now, the irony is, of course, 300 years after the life of Christ, the emperor converts to Christianity, and another 100 years later under Theodosius, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden you have this flip-flop where now the state itself is not just converted to Christianity, but actively promoting it, and now persecuting pagans. Mm-hmm. And the reason the emperors do that is one of the biggest problems for emperors at that point in time is legitimacy. That there's tons of civil wars where you have lots of different people saying, I'm emperor. Mm-hmm. So lots of generals declaring themselves emperor. Now, under a polytheistic religion, that's just, you're all just fighting, it doesn't matter. But if you say there is only one God, then if that God picks someone to be his emperor, they're the only legitimate emperor, right? So there is a real advantage to emperors now becoming Christian, because if they can say, we're now a Christian empire and there's only one God and I'm the guy that God picked to be emperor, that means all these other people claiming to be emperors are illegitimate.
Do you think that, or is there other factors that explain why Christianity was able to spread?
Well, I mean, that's why it's appealing to the emperors. And we're talking here, the religious answer is people see the light, right? It's a faith-based thing. I'm looking at this as a historian. So putting aside, religious feeling and saying, okay, if I'm doing an analysis of this as a social phenomenon, what would be appealing to people? And there is that very compelling reason for emperors to want to go to Christianity because it helps them with their biggest problem, which is legitimacy. Now, if you're an ordinary person, what is the appeal of Christianity? Well, we already looked at a couple of them. One of them is that, it promises you a reward in the afterlife. The Roman and Greek notions of the afterlife aren't that appealing. Either you just sort of turn into dust, or at best you turn into this kind of ghost thing that floats around something that looks like a Greek gymnasium, which is like a bunch of grassy fields. It's not so hot. So here you're offered the idea of like, oh, you go to paradise forever. That sounds really good. And secondly, for a lot of people in Roman society, that notion of here's something that says I'm valuable as a human being. It doesn't matter whether I'm free or slave. It doesn't matter whether I'm Roman or non-Roman. It doesn't matter if I'm man or woman. Here's something that says I have equal value. That's enormously appealing. And finally, early Christians, they honestly, a lot of them do good works. They take care of the sick. They feed the poor. If you look at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, that's the stuff he really hammers. If we look at, the words of Jesus when he says, what do you do to be a Christian? A lot of it is, take care of the unfortunate, take care of people who are sick, take care of people who are starving. And a lot of the early Christians really take that seriously. So they are helping people out. So that's appealing.
They're the good kind of populist, and populist messages spread.